I'm really excited to introduce Dr. Pritchard. Dr. Pritchard was a graduate student when I first started at McMaster, and she was probably in the very first class that I ever taught at McMaster. And so it's a real honor and excitement for me to have her talk here. She is now an assistant professor in the School of Interdisciplinary Sciences at McMaster, and she's going to be talking to us about building better bones. Dr. Pritchard?
Great. Thanks a lot, Dr. Raha. I really appreciate the kind introduction. And it's amazing how life comes full circle. And we are now working together, and I was once your student. So, to all of you students out there, you really never know where life will take you, and you might end up working with your previous teacher. So, good morning. I really appreciate the introduction and the opportunity to come and share a little bit with you guys about how to build better bones. This is a topic that is really of interest to me, and it's something I've been thinking about for a really long time. And I'll tell you a little bit of a backstory as to why I care so much about bone health coming up, so you can stay tuned for that. Dr. Raha asked me just to go through kind of just really briefly on how I arrived at McMaster. And so I wanted to show you this really windy road that I've taken from University of Guelph, where I did an undergraduate degree in something called human kinetics, which is essentially just the science of human movement. And to those people out there who are still kind of thinking about, maybe what you want to do when you grow up, I didn't really know what I wanted to do when I grow up. And I really didn't think that I would be working at McMaster University as a professor. What I did know, though, was that I really liked being active. And so you'll see the basketball on the screen there. So I've always played basketball. I started when I was about 8 years old and loved playing and loved being active outside. And so what studying at the University of Guelph did was it allowed me to kind of learn a little bit more about the science as to why it's so important to be active. And you'll see a few other pictures here that have some significance to me, specifically Osteoporosis Canada. So you'll see that logo right kind of at the beginning of the path. That was a really important volunteer experience that I had when I was at the University of Guelph as a student. I had the opportunity to be on the Speakers Bureau for Osteoporosis Canada and actually talk to people in the community about bone health. So that was now about 10 or 15 years ago. And that was one of the things that really sparked my interest in bone health. And I went on to study bones at McMaster with a professor named Dr. Alexandra Papuanu, and she really inspired me to continue learning about bone health and try to contribute to the area of research of bone health. And now I am an assistant professor in the School of Interdisciplinary Science. So I teach in one of the largest programs in the Faculty of Science, which is called Life Science. So if anyone has any questions about the program or anything else kind of job or career related, I'm happy to answer that at the end. I wanted to set a couple ground rules today. So Dr. Raha already mentioned a couple just regards to using our online platform, but just a couple more. I do have a Jamboard that I'd like you to contribute to, and you might be familiar with this. Maybe you've used it for your own class. So I will provide the link in our chat in just a second to that. And so you can actually have the Jamboard open throughout our lecture today. And if you have any curious questions about bone, then you can go ahead and write your question on our Jamboard. And then I also wanted you guys to look out for our character here, Mr. Bones. He's doing kind of a funky dance on the right-hand side. Every time you see Mr. Bones, I want you guys to do something with me. We're going to talk a little bit about physical activity today because it's near and dear to my heart. But it's also so important for us to maintain good amounts of physical activity so that we stay healthy for a really long time. And maybe you can even tell me on the Jamboard coming up as to why you think bone health might be related to physical activity. So every time you see Mr. Bones today, I want you to try this if you can. We're going to try a squat 3 times. And if you haven't never done a squat before, it's actually one of the most functional exercises out there. So what I mean by functional is it actually mimics some of the things that we do in our everyday life. Just think to yourself, what things do you do throughout the day that involve you squatting down, right? Even just sitting on a chair. That's a squat. And so what I'd like you to do is every time you see Mr. Bones on the screen, try 3 squats. And if you really want to get, advanced and take it to the next level, after you finish your squat, you can jump up in the air. And we'll come back to why this might be good for bone health in a little bit, but this will also keep you moving throughout our little lecture today. So if you can do that, that would be awesome. I'd also wanted to mention something before I post the link to our Jamboard, just a heads up. So on our Jamboard, this is basically a whiteboard where you can actually add sticky notes, and you'll have the opportunity to add sticky notes to our parking lot. So this is where I want you to park your curious questions about bone health, and then I'll try to address them at the end of our lecture. You'll notice that there are 2 slides, and so you can see up here, I'll just get my highlighter. You can see up here, this is the slide advancer. So you'll see 2 slides. You'll see the parking lot slide, and then 1 slide that will ask you about why we should care about our bone health. And that's a little activity that we'll do just to kind of get our juices flowing this afternoon or this morning. The other important button I want to draw your attention to is just here on the left-hand side. And that is the button that you'll click to create a sticky note and add it to our parking lot or to the slide where I ask you a little bit about bone health. Okay, the other little introduction I just want to give as to what we're going to be talking about this morning. So we're going to go over some bone basics, and I thought that this was important just to make sure that we're all on the same page and we know a little bit about bone health before we start to talk about what you can do and what you can eat to make your bones as strong as possible. And then I'll answer one of my bona fide curious questions that I often get asked by other people, family and friends, and then we'll get to some questions that you might have about your own bone health. So that's what you can look forward to this morning. Okay, so I do have a little poll that I want to do. And so I'd like you to look at these faces here, these emojis. And so on this scale of emojis, I want to know, how do you feel about what you know about your bones? Okay, so I just want you to look at this for a second, think about it, and then I'll open the poll in just a moment. So do you feel totally awesome? Do you feel pretty good? Or do you feel not so great? Now, the next step is to go to menti.com, and I will also do this on my screen, and you will be able to enter a join code to put your answer in the poll. And you can see the join code at the top of the screen. And so to get here, you would just go to menti.com. So hopefully you can do that either on another device or you can open up another tab. Let's see if anybody is able to enter their response. And it looks like you guys are answering, so that's great. So shows me that you're awake and you're with me this morning. And most of you guys are feeling pretty good. So this is really good to know. And maybe by the end of our little lecture today, we'll move you from feeling pretty good to totally awesome. So we'll see if we can get there. And for the people who are not so great, that's okay. Maybe we can move you to feeling pretty good. And I hope you'll learn just a couple things in our lecture today that you can carry forward in your life. So I'll just give you another minute or so to enter how you're feeling. All right, it looks like the numbers have kind of stopped. So this is great and good for me to know as well as we kind of move through our lecture. So here are a few true-false questions that I'd like you to just think about. And if you want, you can write down the answers on a piece of paper that you might have in front of you, or you can just kind of think about them. So the first question is, you have fluid rushing through your bones. Is that true or false? The second question is, your bones will be the strongest that they will ever be at the age of 20. Is that true or is that false? Okay, let's go on to the next 2 and then we'll proceed. Okay, question number 3. There is the same amount of calcium in 8 cups of spinach as there is in 1 cup of milk. Is that true or false? There is the same amount of calcium in 8 cups of spinach as there is in 1 cup of milk. And then question 4, if you break a bone when you are young, this means that you have bad bones. True or false? All right, so what we're going to do at the end of our lecture today, we'll revisit these true and false questions and I will provide the real answers. But as we're going through the lecture, maybe you'll be able to answer these questions as well, or revise your answers, I should say. Okay, So, when we think about our bone health, a lot of people think, our bones are pretty boring, right? Maybe you think the amount of bone that we're born with, that's the amount of bone that we're always going to have. Well, that's not true. Did you know that our bones are remodeled at the rate of 10% every year? So, what this actually means is that over the next 10 years, you will basically have a brand new skeleton. So, there's this remodeling process happening within our bones. And did you know that actually there is fluid rushing through our bones, through an area of our bone called the canaliculi? And that word actually comes from the word canal. And every time we move, the fluid rushes through our bones faster, and that actually stimulates bone formation or bone building. And we'll come back to that concept later. Did you know that our bone cells are constantly talking to each other? We might not hear them, but they're constantly talking to each other all day through the day in order to allow us to have healthy bones. So we've got two main types of bone cells, osteoblast cells and osteoclast cells. And we'll come back to what these cells do in a little bit. So maybe rather than going back to the Jamboard right now, I want you just to think to yourself, why should we care about our bone health? So I'll give you just, maybe not a minute, but maybe I'll give you about 30 seconds to think to yourself, why should we care about our bone health? And if you want to write on the Jamboard, you can. I just don't want to move my screen away to the Jamboard at this time. Maybe Rebecca, if you can look at the Jamboard, maybe you can voice some ideas that people are writing down.
Yeah, I'm doing that actually.
Oh, perfect. So what are you
So
seeing there, Sandy?
someone is having fun scribbling, but that's about all I see. So let's see if anything's coming up on the chat.
I see a couple of things in the chat. Someone says we should care because we would be a pile of skin without bones and our bones would break.
Here we go. Yes, bones are weird and they look like bones because they keep you up and make you move. We should care about our bones because otherwise we would be a lump of flesh.
Oh, yeah. So I'll just build on a couple of your ideas. Thank you so much for voicing your ideas. So we heard that otherwise we would be a lump of flesh, which is true. So we need our bones to give us structure. And somebody else says to make you stand up, or maybe rephrase that a little bit. So not only to give our body structure, but also to allow us to stand up and most importantly, to move. So we'll kind of come back to the importance of being able to move and specifically do those squats by the end of the lecture. But here's another reason why we should care about our bone health. So here's a picture of a pretty bad broken hip. So when we think about our hips, you might be able to even feel your pelvis, those two bony points, kind of just around your belly button, but on the sides of your body. So you might be feeling your pelvis. But when we talk about a hip fracture, so you might be feeling, what are these bones here? The top of your pelvis. When we talk about a hip fracture, what we're really talking about is your leg bone as it goes into your pelvis, that forms your hip joint. And what you can see with this nasty image over here is the femur, the neck of the femur is completely broken. This is a displaced fracture. Very painful. You can imagine if this broke. And you can imagine that if this broke in your body, then it would be very challenging to move around. I was really motivated to learn more about osteoporosis, not only because I actually had the opportunity to work in a hospital and see patients after they experienced this kind of awful fracture, but my grandma, shown here in the bottom right of the screen, she experienced a hip fracture. And so maybe some of you guys even have family members or friends who have had a fracture later in life, and you've witnessed just how much that broken bone influences their life. So with my grandma, when she broke her hip, what we saw was this dramatically changed her life. Not only did she have to move out of her house, but then she became wheelchair bound. And when somebody, has to be in a wheelchair, it all of a sudden makes them very dependent on other individuals or other people. So her mobility and her independence was dramatically changed. And she had to move into another living facility. So she had to move out of her home, which was a beautiful little home in Burlington that I used to love visiting. So I think about osteoporosis a lot because hip fractures are devastating to somebody's life. They cost the healthcare system a lot of money to care for, and they're very painful. So here are a few reasons why we should kind of continue to think about our bones while we're young. So, what are bones made of? Well, you might be aware that calcium is a component of our bones. And actually, when we think about where calcium is in our bones, it's actually in this molecule called hydroxyapatite. And you can see the calcium molecule listed in that hydroxyapatite molecule there. So we do know that our bones are made of mineral. Specifically, you can see a large amount of calcium in that molecule. And specifically, calcium is in hydroxyapatite. Now, hydroxyapatite helps to make our bones strong, and we can kind of think about the components of our bones doing different things. So the mineral in our bones gives our bones strength. However, we don't want to have bones that are too mineralized because it could end up like a piece of chalk. I'm sure that even the teachers out there have dropped chalk and it just shatters on the ground, or maybe you've been playing with chalk on the sidewalk and you notice that it can kind of crumble. And so we don't want our bones to be too mineralized. We want to have this balance between mineral and protein. So that brings us to the next part of our bone. Did you know that about 40% of your bone is protein? And specifically, it's this molecule called type 1 collagen. And that collagen allows our bones to be more elastic so that when we walk around, our bones don't shatter. So it's this nice balance between mineral, which makes up 60% of our bone, and protein, which makes up about 40% of our bone, that allows us to be healthy. And just a little pointer, there is Mr. Bones there doing a little dance. So now is the time to stand up and try those 3 squats. And if you can, add in that jump at the end of your squat, and that will make you even stronger. Okay, so here is another little picture to show you what else our bones are. So our bones are not just one flat piece of material or one uniform piece of material that looks the same all through our body. Our bones are actually very similar to a piece of honeycomb. So this is a picture that I took. This is from somebody actually, from a person who was having a joint replacement surgery. So specifically, this piece of bone comes from the neck of the femur, which I've circled here on the image on the bottom right. And if we were to open up the bone there, what you can see is this honeycomb-like structure inside of the bone that we find in the neck of the femur. Now, we find this kind of bone all through our body. This bone is called trabecular bone, and it does resemble a honeycomb. It is kind of gross, I guess, because I did get it from another living human person. And then outside of the trabecular bone is this shell called cortical bone. So we need to remember that our bone is not just one piece of solid material. It's actually this intricate material made up of this webbing or this honeycomb-like structure that is surrounded by a cortex. And there's a picture of a honeycomb just to kind of make you remember really what our bones are made up of. So here is a real picture of bone, and this was taken using an electron microscope. Here you can see this is bone from a 30-year-old woman, and this is bone from a 70-year-old woman. And if we were live in person, I'd probably ask you to tell me what are the main differences that you see here. But just for the sake of time, and because we're in this weird virtual environment, I'm sure that you can start to see some differences. Specifically, yes, you can see that those trabeculae are not as thick in the 70-year-old woman compared to the 30-year-old woman, right? And there are pieces of the trabecular bone that are actually broken. So you can see here, we've got one trabeculae up here and one down here. And you can see that the link between these 2 trabeculae is actually broken. And we'll talk a little bit more about why that happens in a bit. So we need to remember that our bone is not just a piece of uniform, solid material, but it's this intricate network of this honeycomb-like bone that we call trabecular bone. So I challenge you, try to use the word trabecular bone at least one other time today in a sentence. I'm sure you'll really impress somebody else. Okay. So we need to think about this trabecular bone as being very important for the overall strength of our bone. And just a quick reminder, there's Mr. Bones there doing a little dance on the picture of the bridge. So you might be wondering, how does this trabecular bone actually make our bones stronger? Well, we can think of the trabecular bone as something similar to the struts that you see on this bridge. So this is a pretty big bridge. This is in South Africa. And you can imagine how scared this truck driver must be driving across this bridge. And he would be especially afraid if you started to remove these standards or these struts that is making the bridge nice and strong. And that's what our trabeculae do in our bones. It helps to provide strength to our bones. And so if we start to remove the trabeculae from our bones, what it's doing is it's making our bones weaker over time. So when we think about our bone health, we can kind of think about this image of the bridge to allow us to remember that those struts or the trabeculae in our bone are very important. And we want to make sure that we're eating things in our diet and doing things in our life to keep those struts nice and strong. Okay, so you might be wondering, why is bone taken away? Why do the trabeculae actually disappear over time? Well, there are a few reasons. So you might have heard that our bones are the bank for calcium, and 99% of the calcium that we have in our body is actually stored in our bones. Now, calcium is a really interesting atom because we need calcium for lots of different things in the body, not only to make our bones nice and strong. Again, thinking back to the piece of chalk, the mineral provides some strength. But we also need calcium to allow us to do many things. Like if you were participating, you were doing a squat, well, you actually need calcium to allow your muscles to contract. Every time you think and you learn, we actually have calcium being exchanged in the brain between our neurons or our brain cells. So we need calcium for a lot of different things. And when the body needs calcium, if we don't get enough through our diet, our body will go to the bones and actually extract calcium from the bones so that we can do these other things, like flex our muscles, like do a squat, like think, which is obviously very important. Another reason why bone is taken away is over time, we might actually develop some micro cracks in our bone or small amounts of damage. Now, don't be alarmed or scared about this because this is actually a very normal process. And every time you flex your muscles, you're actually creating some small cracks in your bones. This is good because what this does is it tells your bone cells to go and replenish that cracked bone. So creating micro cracks in your bones is a good thing. And this is actually one thing that physical activity does. And what happens next whenever bone is taken away? Well, I mentioned previously when we started our lecture that there are cells in our bones that talk to each other. So the cells that break down bone are osteoclasts or our chomping cells. They actually talk to our osteoblasts or our building cells. And so when the osteoclasts take away bone, they tell the osteoblasts to go in and build bone. So that's obviously very important for keeping our skeleton nice and strong. Okay, so a little bit more about these osteoblasts and osteoclasts. So if you're a little kind of confused about what these terms mean, we can compare this idea to what happens when we put money in our piggy bank or when you put money in a bank account at the bank. So whenever you deposit money into your bank account, you're obviously creating a bit of a savings. And we can think about the deposits that happen by the osteoblast or bone building cells as a way of saving or storing calcium, maybe for a time later in life that we might need to draw on that calcium in our bones. So we want to be able to build up our bones as much as we can by the osteoblasts. But as I mentioned, you want to go out and you want to buy something at a store or use that money for something else, you have to take the money out of your piggy bank or your bank account, and that's a withdrawal. And this is something that the osteoclasts do when the body needs calcium. There's a bit of a technical term here. It's called resorption. And so our bone resorbing cells are known as osteoclasts. And those are the cells that chomp our bones, break them down, and then talk to the osteoblast cells to build our bone back up. And here's a really cool picture that actually shows an osteoclast cell dissolving a part of bone. And what it's doing, you can see it's attached to the bone here, and it's breaking down the bone matrix. And it's doing that by actually secreting a molecule that you might have heard of. It's called hydrochloric acid. And that's the same molecule that we find in our stomach that's responsible for breaking down the food when we eat. So these osteoclast cells secrete hydrochloric acid and other types of molecules to break down the bone. But then they will talk to the osteoblast cells and tell the osteoblasts to go and build that bone back up. All right, so let's just finish on the bone basics before we get to what can be done in our lives to build our best bones. Yes, there's Mr. Bones there. He's hanging out on my graph that I've created. So as you can see in this graph, we've got a couple axes here that I want to point out. On the y-axis, we have the amount of bone, and we have the age in years on the x-axis. And as you can see with this graph, as we age, we build up the amount of bone that we have. And then we hit a certain point in our life where there's a bit of a plateau. And that's also known as a time where there's no dramatic change in the amount of bone we have. But then we hit a point where there's a reduction in the amount of bone that we have. And so I'll highlight these points for you. So yes, it's true that at around the age of 20, and there's some debate by scientists as to when exactly this happens, but most people believe that at around the age of 20, we have the most bone that we will ever have in our whole life, which is a little bit scary because you now want to think about doing everything that you possibly can to get this graph to the highest point that it possibly can get to, because then this is the time that you're going to have the most bone that you're ever going to have. And at the age of around 50 years, there is this progressive decline in bone health. And that happens for men and women. For women, it happens a little bit faster due to the loss of estrogen in the body with menopause. But the bottom line here is that we need to do everything we possibly can up to the age of about 20 to ensure that we have the healthiest bones that we possibly have for the rest of our life. So hopefully I haven't scared you too much, but this is just why it's very important. We need to all think now about what we can do to make our bones the best. And that's the next part of our little lecture today. Okay, so our bones. How much do we get from our parents? As you can see with this little picture here, we get about 50% of our bone health from our parents. That tells us one thing very important, that if our parents have a broken bone later in life, that may tell us that we need to take special care of our bones, especially while we're young, to make sure that we also don't experience a broken bone later in life. Okay, so about 50% of our bone health comes from our parents or from our genes. And, I guess the good news is that we can change about 20 to 40% of our bone health through different lifestyle choices, like things that we eat and the physical activity that we do. So that's the good news story, because we can't pick our parents, right? We cannot change the genes that we have, at least now anyways, but we can modify the lifestyle choices that we make. So it's not too surprising that calcium is a key nutrient to good bones. So I put some recommendations here, which may not mean that much to you just by looking at some of these numbers, but maybe I'll be able to put this into perspective with regards to which foods actually contain some calcium. In addition, at the end of the lecture, what I'll do is I'll put a link in the chat for a calcium calculator that you can try on your own time to determine how much calcium you're currently getting in your diet. And then you can have some ideas as you're going through the calculator as to what new foods you might be able to introduce into your diet to bump that up to meet these recommendations. So the scary thing is that when we're talking about people between the ages of 9 to 18, the amount that is required is about 1,300 milligrams of calcium a day. But for boys, 1 in 3 boys do not consume enough calcium. So that tells us that most boys, 2 of 3 boys, are generally getting enough calcium, but there is that one person who's not getting enough calcium, which is concerning because we know that we want to build up that bone bank by the age of 20. And it's even worse for girls. So 2 in 3 girls aged 9 to 18 years old do not eat enough calcium. So it's really great that you guys are here today trying to think about your bone health, because now you can actually make some changes so that you are not a part of one of these statistics where you're not getting enough calcium. So how to get enough calcium each day? Here are just a few ideas. So if you can drink milk, 1 cup of milk has about 300 milligrams of calcium. And this is a great way to start the day, because then you at least know, okay, you've started to build your bone bank for the day. I don't know about you guys, but as the day goes on, you tend to get busier and busier, or more distracted with going outside and playing or talking to friends online. Now with COVID, hopefully we'll get back to playing outside with friends soon. But if we can start the day with a really good meal and make sure that we get enough milk in our diet, then that at least will be good, because as we go through the day, it's harder to make sure our nutrition is really good. You can add 1 cup of yogurt to your meals as well, or as a snack. And even if you don't want to eat 1 cup of yogurt at a time, you could have half a cup in the morning and half a cup in the afternoon as a snack. And in terms of cheese, cheese is a great source of calcium as well. So 1.5 ounces, which basically amounts to 4 cubes that look like 4 dice. So it's really not that much cheese. That is about 300 milligrams. Now, the kind of cheese will vary with the amount of calcium, but on average, cheese is a great source of calcium, yielding about 300 milligrams. 1 cup of orange juice that is fortified with calcium provides about 300 milligrams. And we can even look to our green vegetables as well. So vegetables like broccoli and kale and spinach and bok choy, as you can see here, provides calcium. Bok choy is a good vegetable with calcium. About half a cup of bok choy provides about 85 milligrams of calcium. 1/4 cup of almonds provides about 100 milligrams of calcium, and half a cup of these edamame or soybeans provide about 85 milligrams of calcium. Now, just a quick note about the different amounts of calcium in these foods. In foods like bok choy and almonds and these soybeans, unfortunately, there are other molecules in these foods that prevent the absorption and the availability of calcium from these foods to our body. So we need to eat more of these foods in order to get the same amount of calcium that we would find in, say, 1 cup of milk. So it is true that you would need to eat about 8 cups of spinach to get the same amount of calcium as you would in 1 cup of milk. Now you might be wondering, well, this says 85, but the actual amount of calcium that you can extract from that 85 milligrams is much less for spinach. So that's why it works out to about 8 cups to get the amount that you would find in 1 cup of milk. And there's Mr. Bones there. So if you haven't moved yet, then this is your opportunity to move and try those squats. And little changes can make a difference. We know, changing your behavior, changing your diet is really hard, but here are some suggestions on little changes you can make. Can you add chia seeds to your yogurt if you like to eat yogurt? Or can you add some chopped almonds to the top of your yogurt, or put that on some cereal in the morning? Can you sneak some more greens or ricotta cheese into sauces that you're eating? And maybe if there are any parents out there, I'm speaking directly to you, can you do these things in order to up the amount of calcium in the dishes that you're serving? Or can you, pair a fruit like apple with some cheese or even some almond butter as a snack? So remember, little tiny changes make a difference. And when you go through the calcium calculator on your own, maybe you'll see some other foods that you like or want to try, and you'll be able to even just try to introduce these foods once or twice through a week, and then maybe it'll become more regular, 3 or 4 times a week, and then it becomes once a day. So keep that in mind too. One of my favorite ways to eat chia seeds is I always just throw them into muffins that I'm baking, or I even put them into cookies. But I do like to make chia pudding, and you can use about 2 tablespoons of chia seeds to about half a cup of milk of your choice. So that could be an almond milk, a soy milk, coconut milk, or even regular milk, with a little bit of cinnamon and a little bit of maple syrup, and you've got a nice chia pudding there that you could top with some fruit. Okay, so there are 2 things that go well together when we're talking about bone health, kind of like salt and pepper. It's calcium and vitamin D. So calcium cannot get to the bones without vitamin D. So that's a very important thing for us to remember. So we can eat all of the calcium that we want, but unless we have enough vitamin D in our body, the calcium is going to be locked in our intestine and it won't actually make it to our bones. So we need to have vitamin D in our body to ensure that that calcium makes its way to the bones. And just to give you an idea of how much is needed, for people 4 to 70 years old, you need about 600 international units of vitamin D each day. You might know that you do get vitamin D from the sunshine, but I don't know about you, but these days I am not going out with my bare arms and my bare legs as I would in the summertime to get that vitamin D. What happens is the sun emits UV rays, which converts vitamin D to active forms in the skin. But we need to have a good amount, about half an hour of full body sun exposure in order to get enough vitamin D in our body. So while we're living through the winter months in Canada, that's really hard to do. And so we have to turn to some other sources, which I'll show you in just a moment. Vitamin D is really hard to get through our diet, which is reflected through the statistic that you can see here, where 8 out of 10 or 9 out of 10 boys, or 80 to 90%, of boys and girls aged 9 to 13 are not getting enough vitamin D from their diet. But vitamin D in general is really hard to get from their diet. So a lot of people turn to supplementation. And actually what some research has shown is that although people are not getting vitamin D from their diet, people do have sufficient levels of vitamin D, particularly children do of this age group. And that may be because they are starting to take a supplement, because that's becoming a little bit more well known in our Canadian society that we should be taking this vitamin D supplement. So it seems like the message is getting out there that it's really hard to get vitamin D throughout the year in Canada, and that some supplementation may be needed because it's really hard to get vitamin D through our food. So here are just a couple sources of vitamin D that you can get through food. So milk is a great source of vitamin D because our milk in Canada has been fortified with vitamin D. And in addition, salmon, so 2.5 ounces of salmon, which is about the size of a deck of cards, that provides about 250 international units, as well as some other varieties of fish as well. And there's another food source out there, it's called cod liver oil, and about 1 teaspoon of cod liver oil contains about 450 international units of vitamin D. So if you're able to take cod liver oil each day, then you're almost at your recommendations for vitamin D. But a lot of people really don't like the taste of cod liver oil, so that's a barrier for consuming it. An option might be trying to put the cod liver oil in foods that you are eating. So you could maybe combine it in a smoothie that you make in the morning, or maybe you use a little bit in a salad dressing with some other oils, because it is quite a potent taste. And if you can't get your vitamin D from some of these sources, then you can turn to supplements. And here's one example. It's called D drops, and it's just 1 drop of this liquid provides about 600 international units. So I think in Canada, more people are doing this these days, and that's reflected through the research showing that most kids are actually sufficient in vitamin D. Now, as we age, it's important to know that the ability of our body to make vitamin D goes down over time. And perhaps even as we age, we start to become less conscious or aware of taking supplements. And so it becomes more of a problem of vitamin D insufficiency with age. Okay, the last thing that we can do to make our bones nice and strong is we need to move. As I mentioned, every time you flex your muscle or contract your muscle, like when you're squatting down, you are actually causing your bones to bend a little bit. And when your bones bend a little bit, what it causes is that rush of fluid through the canaliculi, or the canals of our bones, and that stimulates our bone building cells. So movement is very important to having good bones. And in general, we need to try to do more weight-bearing exercise. Here are a couple of examples here. Even just walking outside is a weight-bearing exercise. Running is a weight-bearing exercise. Anything where you are upright and resisting gravity, that is a weight-bearing exercise. So even, activities like kicking a ball around, or when we can play sports together with our friends again, we can do that, and that's a great weight-bearing exercise. Soccer, basketball, volleyball, gymnastics, even going out for a hike. So I encourage you guys to try to get outside more and explore nature. And when you're doing this, you're not only reaping the mental health benefits of being outside, but you'll also be building up your bones. And then finally, doing things like skipping, which is a great activity that you can do on your own. And that will help to build up the bone in your hip. The sad thing and the frustrating thing is that only 7 to 20% of kids are meeting the guidelines for physical activity. And when we talk about how much physical activity we should be getting, we should be trying to get about 60 minutes of activity a day. And now this is activity where your heart is racing a little bit faster than when you're just at rest. You might be breathing a little bit harder and faster. If you were to rate the difficulty that you're feeling or that you're working at when you're being active, you would say that maybe it's about a 6 out of 10 or a 7 out of 10. So when you go for that walk, try to go quickly. Okay, so just a couple more slides before I can take some questions. So in extreme situations, we know that people who rest in bed for a long period of time, this leads to a lot of bone breakdown and less bone formation. In one 2-year study of young kids about age 11 to 14, the more sedentary the people were, the less bone that they had. And when we think about what adding physical activity does, it actually had a dramatic impact on bone. So every hour that you add of physical activity adds bone to our skeleton, specifically about 0.02 grams per centimeter squared, which might not sound like a lot, but over time, this can contribute to more healthy bones. So we want to remember back to that piggy bank idea, and we want to think of the idea that every time we're more sedentary, not moving around very much, we have more bone breakdown going on. And every time we move, we're building up our bone bank. Just as a quick plug about screen time and watching TV, one study showed that people who watched lots of TV, that's 14 hours a week, so I guess that's about 2 hours per day, compared to people who watched less TV, the people who watched lots of TV had 100 grams less bone. And this was a study done in kids. So I know that we are more attached to our computers and maybe even to our TVs these days with COVID-19. But this is just a reminder to try to move when you can, even though we are kind of confined to our homes. Get outside if you can in a safe space and move around, or even just take breaks throughout the time that you're learning and do some squats to allow your body to continue working. Okay, the last question I just wanted to, mention, and I put this in the advertisement for the talk, so I really wanted to make sure I got here today. So this is a question that I often get from family and friends, and when I was doing some speaking in the community, people often ask this question. If you break a bone when you're young, does this mean that your bones are bad? So this is a really, really hard question to study, and I know some of you out there might be thinking about, you might enjoy science, and so you might enjoy this this explanation as to why this is a really hard question to study. And also, it's important to know in science, we don't always have the answer. So let's think about this for a second. If we took a group of kids and we wanted to see if fractures or broken bones when they're young affects them when they're adults, we would have to follow this group of people for a really long time, 50, 60, 70 years. And that's really hard to do in research. And remember that if we were to do this, we'd have to account for a whole bunch of different variables like diet, like physical activity, and like medication, because some medications can affect bones. So this is a really hard question to answer. What we need to think about is a lot of people break their bones. 40 to 50% of kids break a bone. That's often due to the fact that there is a little bit of undermineralization of the skeleton going on, especially around puberty. But more so, it's probably because kids are running around and having a good time and doing things and running into things and other people and playing. So it's hard to tell if the broken bone is because of the fall, is because of what they ran into, is because of the sport, or is because of something else going on. So a couple things just to think about. Does this keep happening over and over? And does somebody in your family have a broken bone as well? And we're talking about older people in your family. And if so, that's just a reminder to make sure that you're doing everything you can now to keep your bones healthy. So think about diet and physical activity. Okay, so that brings us to the end. Before I go back to kind of looking at your questions on the Jamboard, just to answer those true and false questions. So you have fluid rushing through your bones, that is true. Your bones will be the strongest that they will ever be at the age of 20, that is also true. There is the same amount of calcium in 8 cups of spinach as there is in 1 cup of milk, that is also true. And if you break a bone when you are young, this means that you have bad bones. This is false because it's a really challenging question for us to answer in science. So as you kind of depart from today, a couple things that I'd like you to think about. try using this calcium calculator to see how much calcium you're getting through your diet now, and maybe what foods you might be able to slowly start to introduce into your diet to make the amount of calcium that you have in your diet enough. Maybe you want to think about one calcium containing food and try to add it in a few days a week, and then maybe you can increase it to every day. And then as you go through today, I want you to think to yourself how many times you squat and how important that motion is in your everyday life, from sitting in a chair to sitting on the couch to getting up from the couch. So it's a very important motion that we go through every single day. And if we have a broken bone later in life, one of the first things that could be affected is the strength in our legs and the ability to do that squat. So think about how many times you do that squat and just how important that motion is in your everyday life. So that brings me to the end. Thanks so much for joining. I will stop sharing now and then happy to take some questions. If anybody has any, I can go back to the Jamboard and see what you guys have written down.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pritchard. That was a great lecture. I see all the reactions coming in. We do want to talk about this topic. It's an exciting topic. We're going to get to the questions now. And if you put up your hand and you want to actually turn on your mic and ask a question, that's great. There was a question up in the chat window that was really interesting because Dr. Pritchard, when you talked about the osteoclasts and the osteoblasts, you said they were talking to each other, and that question came up that said, do they talk to each other, with a question mark. So I'm going to let you answer that, but I also want to let everyone know that there is actually a video on the MCYU website called Exercise Messengers that addresses this exact question. And you can go to that video and watch it, but I'm going to let Dr. Pritchard answer that question.
Okay, thanks, Dr. Raha. That's a great question. Yes. So for simplicity's sake, I said that the two cells talk to each other. And what I guess they are really doing is they are sending chemical messages to each other to communicate. So those osteoclast cells, as they are chomping bone, they are also sending the messages to the osteoblast cells to build bone. And these messages are, we call them chemical messengers. They can be proteins, they can be other, smaller polypeptides. So various different kinds of molecules that are used to communicate between these two different kinds of cells.
There's another question that says, how do bones form?
Okay, how do bones form? One of the important steps to bone formation is the osteoblast cells have to lay down a foundation. And so the foundation is those protein molecules, and those protein molecules are then mineralized with more mineral that's added down by the osteoblast cells. And this process is going on through our whole life, as I mentioned, especially if there's a little bit of damage done to the cells with those little micro cracks. It's a process that's continuing all through our lives.
That's great. So once again, if anybody wants to speak up, they can raise their hand and we'll get to them. So there's another question that says, why do bones hurt when I break them?
That's a good question as well. Really curious question. And we need to remember that around our bones are a bunch of different kinds of tissues. And just like, if you're walking and you stub your toe, tissues can be affected by you stubbing your toe. And when you do that, also pain receptors are activated. So there will be these receptors within our tissues and actually even around our bones as well. And so these pain receptors are activated, kind of sending the signal that a painful stimulus has just taken place. So those receptors are around our bones, but also integrated and in the tissues that surround our bones as well. Everything from the skin to the muscles has these pain receptors.
That's great. There was a question way back at the beginning, and I was trying to find it, I couldn't, but I thought it was a really good question. That was, why are bones white?
That's a great question. These are questions that university students don't even ask. So I would say, I think that bones are white because that is what color hydroxyapatite is.
I think so too. I was trying to think about the answer too. There's another question here that says, during the winter, the sun is only available for a limited time. With this limitation, what would be the best substitute of it?
It's really hard to get that natural vitamin D synthesis in our body in the winter time. So a lot of people do use a supplement in order to replace that sunshine that they might get in the summertime. So, what I would suggest you do is you might want to talk to your family doctor about whether that's right for you and what kind of supplement you might want to try if you did go that route. I did mention a couple of food sources of vitamin D as well. So, you could try that cod liver oil. You might try it and you find right away that you can't stomach it. It also does come in capsule form as well. So, if you can't take the actual oil itself, you could try the capsule. I know that is still going to a supplement. I often like to try to encourage people to get their nutrients from food first. But with vitamin D, it's just very hard because there's only a limited number of foods that contain enough vitamin D to get us to the levels that we need to be at.
Then there's another question, how do bones decay?
Interesting. So the word decay, I'm wondering if this means how do bones become weak over time, like in the body or afterlife?
How do they break down?
Okay, break down. It's a really good question. There are various reasons that bones break down. So, even not eating enough calcium in your diet, our body will need calcium. And so, the body will start to break down bones in order to provide calcium for those other functions that I mentioned before, like flexing your muscle or allowing you to think properly. And the way that that happens is by those osteoclast cells releasing hydrochloric acid and other molecules to break the bone down. And you can think back to that picture I showed you of the osteoclast actually eroding the bone. And so it's the osteoclasts that are signaled to break down the bone due to various things. Most often, it's if we're not getting enough calcium through our diet, our body needs to get calcium from somewhere, so it turns to the bones. There are other things that can cause this process to happen. Some medications may cause this to happen. Hormone changes may cause this to happen. But one of the things that we can control the most is calcium in our diet. So let's make sure we're getting enough calcium in our diet so that our bones are not being broken down unnecessarily.
Yeah, and that video I mentioned on the MCYU website called Exercise Messengers talks about this answer in a little bit more detail. The next question is doing weight training any better for bones than simply body weight exercises?
Yeah, that's a really good question too. And we need to think about the move it or lose it idea. And the more that we are pushing our body, the harder we're working, the better it's going to be for us. So if we are only able to do some squats throughout the day, then that's still going to be helpful. If we are able to put some soup cans in our hands and do the squats, that's going to apply a little bit of extra stress on the body, which is going to even be more beneficial than body weight alone. So using weights does help, but if anything, just go against gravity and use your own body weight because that has also been shown to be beneficial for bone health. And there's a little bit of controversy around, children doing resistance training and the time that that should actually happen or start to take place. So I would say, play, get outside, run around. These are all excellent things that you can do for your bones. Grab a skipping rope, skip, because just think every time you jump, you're actually starting to build bones in that hip area, which we know, that's the one area that can be affected by broken bones later in life.
Yeah, and so the next question is, how do the bones heal after being broken?
So that's where our bone building cells come in. And after a bone is broken, it's a major alarm bell that goes off in the body to signal these bone building cells to come in and try to repair that broken bone. And oftentimes, the broken bone needs to be stabilized, sometimes with a cast, in order for this to happen. But even as this is happening with the bone building cells, the osteoclast cells are still taking away some of that damaged broken bone. And so it's a constant crosstalk between those two types of cells. The bone building cells are then laying down some protein and that hydroxyapatite mineral in order to help the bone reform.
Yeah. There's a funny question here about how would this affect a cat? But I think how I would interpret that question is bone formation and bone breakdown the same in animals as it is in humans?
I think that the process is fairly similar, and that is one reason that in science we can actually use animal models to learn a lot about human health. And so, in the area of bone health, dogs are used and rats are used because we see the same kinds of processes going on. I see somebody asked about the white patches in the nail, and
Yeah.
that is a curious question. There has been no scientific literature to really say that if someone has white patches on their nail, that that is an indicator of calcium deficiency. The best way to know how much calcium you're getting in your diet is to use the calcium calculator, like I provided for you today. Or you can go to your doctor and speak with them about it, and they may decide to do an analysis in your blood to determine what your calcium levels are like. So I think that the white patches in the nail, and I'm not sure where that started, but I don't think it's as accurate of an indicator as we once thought.
Yeah, and there's a really good question here about are there diseases that might predispose you to breaking bones?
Yeah, there are. And some of these diseases are common in Canada, in our society. Diseases like celiac disease and some other digestive diseases that cause the lack of absorption of nutrients, those diseases can be related to broken bones. There's another disease called Cushing's syndrome, which is associated with a risk of having broken bones. So there are some diseases that can predispose people to breaking their bones.
Yeah. Is too much calcium bad?
There is the concern, and this was kind of something that came up when a lot of people started to turn to taking supplements. So, oftentimes, we know how hard it is to change our diet. And so, some people will just go and buy a supplement. Unfortunately, when people overdo it with supplements, we start to see the effects of over consuming a nutrient. And this was true for calcium, where in some large studies, researchers started to notice the appearance of kidney stones and high levels of calcium in the blood and in the urine, which can be detrimental even to other hormones in the body. And so you can consume too much calcium. It would be very hard to do through diet, but to people who are out there who want to grab a supplement and take 1,000 milligrams of calcium by supplement, try to first get your nutrients from food. And by doing this also, like let's say you're drinking a glass of milk, you're also getting your vitamin D through that glass of milk as well. So you can overdo it. So start with the calcium calculator, see how much you can get through your diet, and that would be a good kind of benchmark to see how much you're getting.
You answered this question, but somebody wants to know about when they've had a broken bone and they bend it a little bit, it hurts. They want to know why that hurts. So maybe you could just repeat your answer a little bit.
Yeah, so I think it has something to do with the pain receptors in and around the bone. And there is another idea of a bone bruise forming in the bone after a bone has been injured. And this is something that might stick around in the bone forever. I also have a little spot on my tibia that I injured years ago, and it's still painful to touch because bone is a little bit different than other tissues. And it does take, as I said, 10 years to kind of remodel the bones that we have in our body, or we're remodeling at a rate of about 10% per year. There is less turnover compared to some other tissues in the body. So those feelings of pain might be sticking around for a long time.
So it is getting a bit late. And so I want to end off. So I'm going to end up with one last question. There's a question if you have any recommendations, Dr. Pritchard, about vitamin D drops for kids in the range of 9 to 18.
Yeah, so the thing with the recommendations for vitamin D is actually that people age 4 to 70 should be getting at least about 600 international units, which is the amount that you can find in one of the D drop formulations. If you go to the drugstore, you'll be able to see D drops. Usually they come in 400 international units, 600 international units, and then even 1,000 international units. Some people, as they get older, they will need more vitamin D. So the 600 kind of should be considered a minimum, especially for older adults, but you should be able to find 600 international units for vitamin D drops. Or if you don't want to use the drops, you could just use a pill form supplement, but the drops are so easy. You can put a drop into your orange juice or glass of milk in the morning and you won't even taste it.
That's wonderful. I'd like everyone to join me in thanking Dr. Pritchard. Maybe you could use your reactions tab at the bottom of the window. And stay tuned. Check our website. We are trying to roll out new and different things for you to participate in addition to what you're doing with online learning. I know it's a lot of online stuff, but it's most important that we do physical distancing and stay safe. It looks like you have a question.
I just wanted to say thank you to all of you for presenting, and I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We really appreciate you saying that. We hope to bring you more and different things. So thank you, everyone. And I want to just thank Dr. Pritchard again. And we'll see you next month. Keep tuned to our website for new and exciting things that you can participate in between now and then. Take care.